This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts. Welcome to Body Count, a history podcast.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to skip the intro this week. One, because we're not doing our normal thing, and I'm very, very excited. But we are going to skip through all the nonsense just because there's not going to be as much nonsense this week. And I know people are not used to that from me. So I continue to say that I'm going to never do two things anymore. I'm going to stay away from Russia and the Soviet Union, and I'm going to stay away from Churchill. But here we are again this week, right back to Winston Churchill, because I apparently cannot help myself. And I am joined by a guest this week. If you would like to introduce yourself, guest.
Hi, I'm Richard Toye. I'm a professor of history at the University of Exeter in the UK, and I am the author of several books on Winston Churchill, the latest of which is called Winston Churchill, A Life in the News, which is available at all good bookstores and online.
Online, good. That everybody will be able to find it for all of we Kindle lovers in America, for sure. Everybody will be able to grab it on Amazon. That's where a lot of people are going to be looking and be grabbing stuff. So I'm very excited to have you on today. I'm a big fan. And of course, I have not gotten into this book yet, but I certainly will as soon as opportunity presents itself. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what this particular book is looking at specifically?
Well, there are really three themes, one of which is Churchill as a journalist. So he started off as a young man fighting in imperial wars and as a soldier, but being a journalist at the same time as well. And that was really how he made his name. And then the second theme is his image in the news and how that changed over time. So now, for example, we always obviously associate Churchill with a cigar. But if you go back to before World War I, the thing which the cartoonists used to draw so that you knew it was Churchill was actually a tiny little hat. And that went on for quite some time before the cigar took over. And then the third theme is Churchill's control of the news, or attempts to control the news, particularly when he was in office, but also when he was out of office, when he was trying to influence proprietors and editors to create a favorable image of himself, and particularly during World War II, when there obviously was a wartime censorship regime, and Churchill got rather upset, actually, because he felt he didn't only want to sort of censor military secrets. He often felt that the criticism that was being offered of the government was destructive, it was damaging to morale, and, sort of got quite close to shutting down a major newspaper, the Daily Mirror, during the early part of the war.
Well, it's not a small book. I'll give you that. My goodness, we have a lot. We have a lot to get through and a lot to cover. That is exciting. So let's start, because a lot of people, when we talk about Churchill, tend to just associate to the Second World War. But I think it's so interesting that he really starts to make a name for himself, especially in those younger years, particularly with the news. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, his first experience in journalism was when he went to Cuba, actually, in 1895. So he joined the army. He had a bit of leave before he was going to be shipped out for India. And being Churchill, he thought, I'm going to go and do something very exciting. There was, of course, the Spanish were attempting to put down a rebellion in Cuba at that time. So Churchill wasn't fighting in that war. People sort of tried to hint that he was. It obviously would have been sort of wrong of him to fight on the side of another country's army while he was serving in the British Army. So he had to deny that. So all these rumours, sort of fake news, if you like, started floating around even in that point. And he was writing then for the Daily Graphic, which was a paper that his own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had written for. So he'd seen that his father had been able, after he'd lost office as Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister, in the 1880s, he did a tour of South Africa and got very, very highly paid for sort of quite outrageous articles being quite rude about the local people. And Winston Churchill obviously saw this and thought, this could be the kind of thing that I could do. So he's actually writing for the same paper that his father did. He's not being as sort of wildly outrageous as his father was, actually. But nonetheless, there's sort of a sensational aspect to this. And he simply goes from strength to strength, so that he then fights on the northwest frontier of India in 1897 and reports that. He fights in the Sudan in 1898. He leaves the army and goes, when the Boer War, the Second South African War, breaks out in 1899, he goes as a journalist for the Morning Post, a very, very highly paid journalist by now, and then actually during the war rejoins the army and is kind of fighting and writing at the same time. So these were wanting to go into politics. I don't think that he set out to establish himself as a journalist for the sake of that. He wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted people to know who he was. He also needed money in order to have a political career. And so these things worked well for him, but he also continued his journalism intermittently throughout most of his career. So clearly he wasn't doing it during the Second World War, but one newspaper, the Sunday Dispatch, was republishing old articles of his. So his articles by Winston Churchill were appearing week after week for sort of the first half of the war. And then the sort of the last things he writes really are in the late 1940s. For various kind of tax reasons, he gives up for the most part. But so this is nonetheless a consistent theme. It waxes and wanes, but he's writing a lot throughout his political career.
I've got you. So maybe not necessarily the love or what he wanted to do, but a means to an end. But he also, obviously had some kind of love and some kind of talent for this, because he never gave it up. And he realized, I would assume, that it was an excellent jumping off spot and it was an excellent tool that he could use as he's going through his career. That's interesting. I did not know that. So that being said, he didn't start out to make that name, and he didn't even begin necessarily in India, which I think a lot of our listeners are going to kind of have an aha moment that we don't begin there. We go back to Cuba. So that's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about when we're getting into kind of making his name. We're talking a little bit about his career and publicity. What specifically, did he ever write with the aim of getting his name just out there, or was he reporting things that he's experienced and seeing? What was kind of the impetus? What was his jumping off point for the things that he wrote specifically?
Well, I think he wanted to be an author, so he did turn much of what he wrote into books. That's not to say he just republished the articles. Sometimes he did. But he sort of uses experiences and, obviously parts of the articles which he'd written for books. The Story of the Malakand Field Force is his first book. The River War about the Sudan follows, and so on and so forth. I think that, I think you made an important point, that he's good at this. He obviously is sort of practicing and honing his literary style while he does it. I would say that there's a lot of journalists out there in this period. Many of them also very successful and well known. But it's hard to point to ones who were quite as interesting as Churchill in terms of what they write. They're very much this happened, bang, bang, bang. Quite literally, bang, 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 when it's about a war, really. But they're not very reflective. And I think that a very interesting thing about Churchill is that he's trying to sort of communicate a point of view as well. He's trying to actually make specific arguments about what British policy should be on the northwest frontier of India. So he's actually an advocate of what was called the forward policy, that is more and more sort of gradual expansion. That's to the point where he's sort of recognised as, in some ways, as being rather extreme in advocating that. But it is certainly attempting to philosophize, if you like, to look at the deeper causes of things and reach conclusions rather than just this happened, then this happened, and then this happened. So I think that's why it's possible to do much more interesting analyses of what he is up to than many of his contemporaries.
That's interesting. So let's talk about a little bit what journalism looked like, at least in its early career. Like you said, it's going to be A to B to C, and that is just kind of what exists. So is he the first? Is he really kind of revolutionary in this and trying to affect policy, sort of outline exactly what he's seeing, what he's thinking, when it comes to more than just giving us a series of events, one right after the other? Was that a common theme? I know we said that it wasn't, but were there other authors out there doing the same thing, or is that something that was unique to him at the time?
Well, I wouldn't quite go so far as to say he was a revolutionary, in that, obviously other people had offered reflections in their own journalism before, and I think just in a sense of saying what was journalism like at this point. Remember, it actually it's very important to say it was in a sort of transitional phase, so that this was the era of mass circulation newspapers. The so-called taxes on knowledge had been abolished, so things like paper duties, so things which made it more expensive for ordinary people to buy newspapers had been done away with, not long before Churchill was born, actually. And so you have this great expansion of the press, but you also have new technology. And so Churchill was somebody who was, I think throughout his life, really very enthusiastic for the telegraph. And sometimes a little bit later on in his career, during the Boer War, there are claims, at any rate, that he sent telegrams back to the Morning Post, which cost £350 to send, which in today's money, in the book I sort of did the calculation using an inflation calculator, and it was I forget the precise figure, but you're looking at sort of tens of thousands of pounds in today's money. Now, which sounds insane, but of course these were profitable businesses, and they needed, in order to make their money, they needed to invest. So and also Churchill and other people were kind of using mixed methods, so that sometimes they're sending telegrams, and then sometimes they're writing a kind of a long dispatch and putting it in the post, and it's turning up in the UK kind of 3 weeks after it was written. So that gives you a rather different style of journalism. So sometimes, yes, Churchill actually is telegraphing back, these three things happened, and it's like a paragraph long. And then you've got this more reflective thing, which is more kind of like long form journalism. These are the things which I've seen. These are the experiences I've had. These are the sort of the interesting thoughts I have had. So it's not a kind of a one size fits all picture. There's lots of different things going on. And there have been, more sort of outrageous journalists, if you like W.T. Stead, who were campaigning journalists. Well, I shan't sort of get into telling you all the things that they did, but they were sort of trying to work up sort of emotional shock, if you like, amongst the readership by sensation. They were identifying genuine social problems, like child prostitution and so on, but they were delivering it in a way which looks pretty outrageous attempt to sensationalize and titillate people, really. We have this idea of Victorians were very sort of staid and boring people, but this really wasn't the case.
No, certainly wasn't. That's interesting. So let's go on, a little bit So we've got this. He's kind of making a name for himself. He sees that this is something that he can do. We start out less about trying to necessarily control policy, and a story kind of jumps into it. But let's talk about a little bit in those interwar years. He's doing this to make money. He's doing this to support, his estate and some other things. So I think that's really interesting because it's like you said, I think it's such an interesting relationship that he does have with the news, and that it's not his main goal, but it's kind of something that he can always fall back on, rely on. He can make a name for himself again. He can move through that medium, and I think it's so fascinating. So let's talk about a little bit about interwar years.
Yeah, good. Well, I think you make an important point, which is this was something which helped keep him in the public eye. And I'll just say a quick word about World War One, actually, because it's during that period, again, during part of that period, he's obviously out of office, and he gets rather frustrated. I think that by the standards of most MPs, a speech by Churchill was always well reported. But of course, he didn't have absolute control over, how it would be reported, which bits of it would be reported, how prominently it would be reported. And so he sort of rather gets the feeling that he's not being particularly well reported, and that writing articles is something where he can make £250 and he gets his precise message into the paper, and he doesn't have to, spend all that time preparing a speech, which of course took him a long time to do. He did often take sort of several days to prepare speeches, and then find that, it was inadequately reported. So it's kind of a win-win for him, and I think that carries on through the interwar years. He does less journalism during the 1920s. Of course, he's Chancellor of the Exchequer during the 1924 to 29 period, and Stanley Baldwin, who was the Prime Minister, actually made a rule that ministers shouldn't be writing for the newspapers. That was less aimed at Churchill, I think, than his friend F.E. Smith. But of course, Churchill, he sort of bends the rules slightly, you could say, because he is serializing his book, The World Crisis, of his kind of memoir come history of World War One. That's appearing in the papers. So, again, people who are opening up their newspapers will be seeing a lot of stuff written by Winston Churchill. But what he wasn't, for the most part, doing was writing original articles about sort of current events. And I think that was, in particular, what Baldwin was keen to avoid. And so when Churchill is out of office again during the 1930s, the famous so-called wilderness years, then this is an opportunity. You quite rightly mentioned Chartwell, his country house in Kent, which he bought without really consulting Clementine, his wife, who was not terribly happy about that and had to take responsibility for running the whole place. And so it's very, very expensive to keep up. So he does a combination of things, and we see that some of what he turns out, or some of what appears under his name, is hack work, basically, just really written for the money, like things like Great Bible Stories Retold. And he gets a friend of his, Eddie Marsh, to use him 50 quid to write one of these things, which then appears under Churchill's name, and Churchill gets most of the fee. So it's a good bargain. But he is also writing serious articles in mass circulation papers, like the Evening Standard, Daily Telegraph. He has to juggle these different newspapers because they don't want, no editor wants to have an article by Churchill the same day that another newspaper has also got an article by Churchill. So they get a bit cross with him if two appear too close together and so on. So he obviously is using this to earn money, but he is also using it to get serious points about European politics across. And in the later 30s, a man called Emery Reeves, who is a sort of newspaper agent, if you like, or journalistic agent, says, well, look, I can get your work translated and published in many more places across Europe. And again, that's a win from the financial point of view, but it's also a win from trying to get Churchill's message across in neutral countries and allied countries like France, for example. I would say, I think the key thing is that he almost always had more than one agenda going on at the same time. So some of it was pretty much just for the money, but mostly there was a kind of a combination of motives.
Well, it wouldn't be Winston Churchill if there wasn't, to be fair. There's nobody that can juggle better than that man in particular. But I would also say, so despite all of that, we're looking at all that, we're putting all that kind of together here in that we have multiple motives. What were his feelings? I mean, he obviously loves the news. He can obviously use it as a jumping off point for his political career. He can get his agenda across. He can say exactly what he wants to say. Was he news obsessed himself, though? Was he always reading everybody else and being in that? Okay.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of describing it. There's a story from his honeymoon in 1908 when he went to Venice, and Clementine was walking down the street with him, admiring all the beauties of Venice. Looked around, and Winston has disappeared, and she goes back, and then she finds that he's managed to find a copy of the Times, probably, or several copies of the Times, probably a few days old by the time that they've wended their way from London to Venice, and he's sitting down and he's obsessively reading it. And there's still stories from World War II about him in the House of Commons, in the smoking room or one of the bars, sort of sitting there reading the newspaper as though there were no other source of information available to him. Which, of course, he has many other information, including top secret ones. But he reads a wide range of newspapers, often sitting in bed. You know that he was somebody who sort of kept irregular hours, and then sort of woke up late and had breakfast while sort of reading multiple newspapers and so on. He wasn't somebody who only read newspapers that he agreed with to kind of reinforce his own ideas. He read, pretty much across the spectrum. I mean, he didn't read the Daily Worker, I don't think, sort of the communist newspaper, but of the mainstream newspapers, sort of from Labour to liberal to conservative. I think that he did read them all at one time or another, and then he kind of had a preferred order in general, so that he always used to like to read the Daily Telegraph last. He said, because I know that will be all right. So that he did kind of like. He said he did kind of I mean, as everybody does, I'm sure, want to have their prejudices reinforced to a certain extent, but he wasn't just going after. I mean, to be absolutely honest, it wasn't like he was just switching on Fox News and being told what he wanted to hear.
Oh, that was good. That was funny. Agreed. And he's so interesting. He really is. But he was also the kind of guy I always got the feeling that would just, he was always looking for those different points of view, anything that he could to enhance his own policy, if it were. So I think that's fantastic, and that he's news obsessed, clearly. So we're going into the Second World War. What is Churchill's relationship with the news as we've got him going into the Second World War? He's the prime minister, all that fun stuff. This is nothing new to anybody, or shouldn't be on this show at this point. But what is his relationship with the news in these years?
Well, again, changing technology, I think, is important. So during the interwar years, he's actually, he first appeared in a newsreel even before World War One. But of course, what you have in the late 20s is the talkies and sound. And so now you have newsreels, and I don't know whether people will be totally familiar with these. I'm sure that everybody has seen clips of them on documentaries, but newsreels were things which were shown in the cinema before the main film, and you'd have different newsreel companies would produce different kinds of packages. And the key thing here, of course, is that a newsreel isn't quite like TV news in that now, of course, you can have live TV, or you can have very, very up to the minute, sort of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But a newsreel package had to last. So it had to make as much sense if you saw it on the Friday or on the Saturday as if you saw it on the Monday. So there was, it wasn't trying to sort of give you a minute by minute account of everything that had just happened. It was sort of trying to summarize, if you like. And there were different classes of cinemas as well. So there were the posh cinemas, which would get the newsreel in the first week. There were the slightly sort of middle range cinemas, which would get the newsreel in the second week, which was cheaper. And there were the really kind of scuzzy cinemas, which would get the newsreel in the third week. So a newsreel potentially had to be sort of, it had to have a bit of a shelf life, right? And so what you don't have, you don't have a guy with a microphone standing there and saying, Mr. Churchill has just become Prime Minister. What does this mean? I'm going to ask this guy standing next to me. What you've got is you've got voiceovers. So, here's Mr. Churchill walking into 10 Downing Street. It's a different kind of news that we're not really, which now seems very probably antiquated and funny and strange, but of course had mass audiences because millions of people were going to the cinema. And we could also know a little bit about how people reacted to it. And this is part of the book as well. How did people react to news about Churchill? And there was an organization called Mass Observation, which had been founded in 1937, which did all sorts of weird and wacky things, trying to find out about ordinary people's lives and their opinions. And they sent observers into cinemas, and they got them to time how long people clapped or cheered when particular people appeared on the newsreels. So, again, there was kind of an audience interaction thing. You didn't just watch the news. It's like Churchill came on, or the King came on, or Neville Chamberlain came on, and people would go, hooray, or maybe they wouldn't go hooray, and there would be somebody who was monitoring whether or not these people generated much interest or excitement. And Churchill was certainly one of the from the start of the war was one of the more popular figures, and I think that he not only through newsreel but also through broadcasting had again maintained himself in the public eye, and perhaps managed to come across as being more warlike and determined than Chamberlain. And this was one of the factors which, helped prepare him or made him a viable candidate for becoming Prime Minister in May 1940.
That is really interesting. A time when you went in before there were dancing candies, before the movie started, and no Nielsen ratings. So that is fascinating. It's really interesting that he can already kind of gauge his popularity from that. And that, to me, is fun. That's not something that we necessarily consider, a lot of people consider when they sit down and they think about news and they think about what things particularly look like at this time period. It's something that we have to talk about a lot on this podcast when we go back to tell our stories, is that, you couldn't just tweet directly to the public, which is questionable anyway, but we'll go on. So we've got that going on. We've got that particular involvement. What specifically, because you talked about when this started, when he's looking at the news going into the Second World War and how he feels about censorship, and how he feels particularly about what cannot be reported as we get into wartime itself. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think everybody's going to be very excited to hear about censorship. It's a hot button these days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, there obviously were things which was really important to prevent the Germans or other enemy countries from knowing, and in a way that was uncontroversial. And the way that the censorship regime worked was that you didn't have to submit what you wrote to the government before publication. However, if you published something which was against the regulations or was judged to be against the regulation, then you would be in trouble. And so what you would want to do would be to go to the censors and say, can I publish this? Is it okay? And if they said it was okay and you did it, then you were in the clear. So there was a sort of a strong incentive to make sure that the censors had signed off on it. I mean, of course, they might sometimes make mistakes. There were, of course, sort of a whole category of things which didn't get anywhere near the news. So, for example, the fact that the Enigma code had been broken, obviously, was a sort of absolute sort of top secret. The development of the atomic bomb, absolutely nobody got a whiff of any of this. And then of course there were sort of a range of things which are sort of lesser importance and some kind of grey areas and so on. So I think that Churchill, in a way, the censorship regime as such was not especially controversial. The journalists sort of accepted that this was a fact of life, but in order to adjust for that, they had to fill the papers somehow, and therefore, expressions of opinion, articles which were comment articles appeared, and these might often be very critical of the government because, of course, there were many times during, in particular, the first couple of years of the war, really up until 1942, when things were going very badly indeed, and people were saying, "Get a grip." I mean, sometimes the criticism may well have been unjustified, but they were. These were things which people were totally sort of legally entitled to say, and it's really so. One newspaper, the Daily Worker, which I mentioned earlier, does get banned in the early part of the war. This, of course, is the period of time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and so the Daily Worker is sort of supporting the Soviet line, which is obviously anti-war at that particular moment. After the Russians have come into the war in 1941, then the Daily Worker is now to publish again. But in a much sort of different category, really, is the Daily Mirror, which was a sort of popular mass circulation. Not quite right to say it was a tabloid, because actually they were tabloid refers to the shape of the newspaper, and the Daily Mirror, like most other newspapers at this time, was much larger than what we would now call a tabloid. But in effect, it's the same kind of thing. It's out to it's rather sensational. It's kind of trying to be sexy. It's trying to have cartoons which the servicemen are going to read, so they're kind of a key part of the audience. And yes, it's critical of Churchill, particularly in the autumn of 1940, and then again early in 1942. And so Churchill really takes offence at some of this. It's not only sort of criticisms of his personally. There's a famous cartoon which Churchill really misinterprets and thinks is trying to, in some way, undermine the war effort or allege that oil companies are sort of profiteering out of the war. And so the Daily Mirror does actually come quite close to being shut down. They're sort of given stern warnings, but the government did have the power to do this if it wanted. Under the defence regulations, it was really if the Home Secretary, that is to say the Interior Minister, decided that a newspaper was damaging morale, he, who always was a he in those days, had the power to shut it down. And so when Herbert Morrison, who's the Labour Home Secretary, starts sort of giving these kind of sort of warnings to the Daily Mirror in Parliament, the rest of the press start to think, well, we don't actually like the Daily Mirror that much, but if the Home Secretary is saying we can just be shut down, these regulations have been in place for a long time, but people started to realise the implications of what this might be. So they actually start to rally round, and the Daily Mirror sort of tones itself down a bit for a while, and sort of draw in their horns, and it's not suppressed. But that was a sort of a key moment, really, where Churchill, I think, wrongly concludes that the paper is damaging morale. I mean, all the evidence suggests that people really were just reading it for the cartoons and for the looking at the pictures of the pretty women and so on, and they weren't really engaging with the political content, and there was no evidence that they were being demoralised by it at all. And of course, the actual effect of all this fuss which is made about the Daily Mirror is to drive up its popularity. It can't actually sell any more copies because there's paper rationing. And so each paper has an allocation, and so it can't print more copies than it was doing. But it starts selling out earlier and earlier in the day. So that's how you can see that it had increased its popularity. So Churchill had made an awful lot of fuss. And indeed, other colleagues in the government had been prepared to go along with it, to an extent, at least, because by this point, it wasn't only Churchill, it was Labour members of the government as well. So whereas in the autumn of 1942, the Labour ministers had sort of said, come on, Winston, aren't you overdoing it a bit? They sort of tried to humour him a bit. But by the time that they themselves have started getting criticised, then they're like, oh, well, we don't really like the Daily Mirror very much either.
Oh, isn't that always how it happens? Just one thing I want to say, because up until this point, I think all of our listeners are definitely going to follow. But I know that as people are listening to this, particularly on this podcast, I do want to emphasize that fascism in particular, as we're looking at the Second World War, is not, we've all had that post-war Allied education that, fascism is a bad thing, but it was a little more prominent perhaps than what people necessarily realize. And so, yes, he doesn't like how his image is represented in a lot of things, but also some of the censorship on opinions, especially as you were talking about, filler and papers and information and criticism. There were not as many people that were just, fascism is maybe not the thing for us, as what people would think now in today's audience when you read something, as opposed to back then.
Well, yes. I mean, I think we have to be aware of the broader context, and of course, it is worth saying that the British press was certainly not perfect in this time. But if you ever try reading like a Nazi newspaper, my God, it's incredibly. Not merely sort of ideologically horrible, but incredibly boring as well. And the British press was quite diverse. It did represent a range of opinions. And of course, there is something a bit paradoxical in Churchill's attitude, in that, he always spoke very powerfully about sort of wanting to defend freedom. And yet he, of course, like many politicians, was very sensitive of his own image. And he did have often rather kind of authoritarian instincts about what should be allowed. And I think this does take us back to, to try and link up what we were saying earlier about his early journalism and his later attitude, so that he, during or after the Anzio landings towards the end of the war, which go rather badly wrong, Churchill again gets very upset about the way in which they're being covered. And he says in the House of Commons, well, when I was a reporter during the period of the Boer War, I would never have been allowed to say that the situation was desperate. The situation the British forces were fighting was desperate. So he actually, having grown up as a journalist, if you like, had actually grown up as somebody who was familiar with military censorship and expected to have to abide by it. that didn't mean that he never said anything which in some ways sort of annoyed the higher military authorities at the time. But he kind of felt there were a set of rules and understandings about what British journalists ought to do, and he felt that he was somebody who had abided by this, and he clearly felt quite differently about some of the journalists during the Second World War.
You got exactly where I was trying to go. So perfect, which is not often something that happens with our guests on this show. Good for you. You've already won that medal. So when we talk about Churchill, of course, we have this very public figure, the way that we always imagine, like you were talking about, the difference in their hat, the cigar. So we have this very public Churchill that we have in the news, that we've got either he's sort of tailored the representation of how he's getting across, or he's writing himself. Would you say that Churchill in the news is a reflection of Churchill the man, or not necessarily? Do the two kind of coincide? Do they meet anywhere in the middle? Is that the reality of Churchill's life, the Churchill that we see in the news, or not so much?
Yes, well, I mean, I think that there were some aspects of his life which he successfully did keep private, and there wasn't an expectation. There weren't there were books about Churchill which appeared during his lifetime, which I suppose were somewhat revelatory, but they weren't sort of Mr. Churchill's dirty secrets really. So there was a sphere, if you like, which he could genuinely keep private, but at the same time he spent most of his life in the public eye, even as a teenager. Really, he was being mentioned in the press because of who his father was, and so he, I suppose, got used to behaving as though, at least a lot of the time, as though he was kind of on display. And I think that he was aware of those times when journalists were present, and he was, the thing about the hats. He claims that, oh well, I'm not really very interested in hats, and the press are always going on about my hats. But actually, you can see that quite often he may not be obsessed with hats in reality, but he knows that they're a useful part of his image. He knows that if he wears a new hat, that might lead to a paragraph in the paper and so on, a kind of a friendly paragraph. So I think that he is aware of the image which he is projecting, and clearly he's very good at doing it, particularly during the Second World War when he's touring bombed areas. He's putting his hat on a stick and he's walking down the street with it, carrying it above his head. So in that sense, I think that he was more comfortable with some aspects of journalism and the media than with others. So I would say that he wasn't particularly good when talking to the camera, on newsreel, for example, but he was good at sort of doing walkabouts and being filmed, sort of walking down the street, inspecting things, and equally, I think he was uncomfortable, strangely, with British journalists often, but much more comfortable with American journalists, with whom he's much more informal and outgoing. Obviously, he sees the importance of this during World War II, but they kind of get a level of access to him that most British journalists generally don't.
That's interesting. Okay. That is interesting in and of itself. I never thought about that, and just the difference in the relationship of who he's particularly speaking to. So we've gotten through maybe early life, relationship with the news. We've kind of got through the First World War, the Second. What is Churchill's relationship to the news as we get into later life, as he's less involved maybe in politics as he's kind of winding down in those twilight years. What was his relationship with the news at that time?
Well, I think that he was somebody who, sort of up until 1945, had been very successful, broadly speaking, in his relationship with the media. I mean, there'd been obviously ups and downs. He'd often been very, very heavily criticized, of course, but in general, he kind of kept pace with new developments. I think that after World War II, obviously that very heavy defeat at the hands of a kind of media-savvy Labour Party in 1945 is a great blow. And I think that as his health declines, he's sort of less able to engage with new technology, such as TV, for example, which is, the newest thing. And so, I think that clearly everything that he does is still news. And that's the case after his retirement as well. But, I mean, I think it's probably rather oppressive, the degree to which every time he went on holiday, wanted to sit and do a painting, of course, which was one of his great hobbies. There would be paparazzi trying to get shots of him. And equally, every time that he fell ill, it was necessary for bulletins to be put out. People were obviously not knowing if he might die in some, in the case of some accidents or episodes of ill health that he had. So he's sort of somebody who is being scrutinized absolutely constantly by this point. So I think there probably is, if his private life had been somewhat off limits earlier on, I think his health becomes a matter of very, very great interest to the press, particularly after 1955. Remembering that in 1953, when he was still Prime Minister, remember he becomes Prime Minister again in 1951 and serves through to 1955. In 1953, he had a major stroke. It wasn't his first stroke, but it was the biggest one that he'd had, which really was a huge blow, but it was kept largely secret from the public to a degree which probably wouldn't be possible today, with essentially the collusion of Churchill's friends in the press, in particular Lord Beaverbrook, the proprietor of the Daily Express, who'd been sort of one of his great friends for several decades. People are dropping hints. The American press is also dropping hints. And people are sort of publishing, again, our friend the Daily Mirror, sort of publishing articles saying, what are we not being told about Mr. Churchill's health? But the public don't know until early 1955, actually, when sort of Churchill kind of drops it as a bombshell in Parliament. And so he was able to, he obviously didn't fully recover, but he substantially recovered to quite a remarkable extent over a period of a couple of months after the stroke. And the public was told Mr. Churchill needs a rest. Well, he certainly did need a rest, but that was far from the whole story.
Perfect. Well, that kind of takes us through beginning to end what it is specifically that this book, which I encourage everybody to go out, definitely read your others, especially if they are lovers of Churchill, which I know we have quite a few. But that kind of covers from beginning to end what it is a little bit that the book is really getting into. And it's a massive understatement to say that remotely we were able to cover any and all of what it's going to talk about. So, Richard, tell us one more time where it is that it's going to be at bookstores everywhere. Give us the title of the book, and then we'll kind of plug into that.
So the book is called Winston Churchill, A Life in the News. It is published by Oxford University Press, so you can get it from their website. There are other websites are available. I hope that it will be in many bookstores, both in the United States and in the UK.
Well, it's definitely looking like it is. You guys will be able to get it anywhere, everywhere. It looks like it's definitely going to be all over Amazon. I know that's where a lot of our listenership is particularly going to go out and find this book. Richard, also tell us where people find you on social media if they want updates as far as the book, anything else that you're working on. You are all over all kinds of things. Did Dan Snow's, deal the other day. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed that. So particularly your Twitter, I know that they can see a lot of the stuff you're working on there. You've got a lot of things that you put out every day. Where would they find you?
So my Twitter handle is @Richard Toye, so that's spelled Toye, and I'm also on Instagram, Richard_John_Toye, although that's less work related. That's more pretty pictures. But great history, the flowers and woods and streams.
Well, you can love both. We're not choosy here at Body Count. So guys, that's going to do it for us this week. Again, I know this is not something that I usually do or something we usually do on the show, but it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. This is a book I'm very excited about. I think that those of you that have really started to put more than the toe in the Winston Churchill pool will definitely enjoy this. If you want to really jump in and just, both feet, enjoy it. You guys are going to love it. It's highly readable. I know that's something that a lot of our listeners worry about as well when we make book suggestions. There are some people out there that are just, it's difficult to read if this is your first time or you're jumping into something like that. Richard is not that way, though. I promise, guys. I promise you're going to love it. But Richard, thank you so much for being on today and letting us talk to you about your book. It's something we're very excited about.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. So, guys, you can join us back next week, and we will be back to our usual ridiculousness, I promise. But for those of you that always ask why I don't ever do anything semi-serious, now you have gotten your wish. We'll see how you like that. But we will be back at you next week. You guys know where to find us, where to follow us. And thank you so much.